Well, hello, Alex. How are you?
Great to see you again.
Good. Today, I think we're going to look at chapter 4, which is a chapter on judgment. What is meant by judgment is this. In the previous talk, we looked at chapter 3, the subject of which is perception. And altered perceptions, are generally treated separately from altered judgments conventionally in psychiatry. So altered perceptions include things like hallucinations and visual illusions, and altered judgments result in delusional thinking or reaching bizarre conclusions. In fact, it's slightly artificial to separate them like this, since some of one's abnormal reasoning towards a conclusion may be based on hallucinations. Equally, the other way around. So one might have a certain experience because one's already convinced of a certain idea or thought. However, I think it works reasonably well to separate it like this. What in short I want to show, because we're on a path to find out how much we can trust the testimony of the left hemisphere and the testimony of the right hemisphere. What I will show, I think, in the discussion today, and what I believe I demonstrate in that chapter, is that on its own, the left hemisphere is, frankly, liable to delusion. And this is a much, much stronger tendency than would apply when the right hemisphere is working alone. So I thought what we might do is begin with looking at some of the categories of delusional thinking, and so that people get an idea of quite how unusual and strange they are, and then look perhaps at some more general things about reasoning or thinking in the two hemispheres. Should we do that?
Great.
Yeah.
Yes, let's jump into it.
Okay. Yes. So I think we've talked about some of these very briefly in relation to attentional deficits. The most obvious example is neglect, where one half of space in all modalities can be neglected to such an extent that the individual doesn't realize that there is reality going on over in the left visual field, not hearing people, not seeing people, not remembering things that have happened there, not projecting that things can happen there. It's like a contraction of the world. And that's partly, if you like, perceptual, but really probably more strongly, it is attention giving rise to a delusional thinking. And then there are a number of others in which, for example, a subject may deny having a deficit. This is called anosognosia, literally not realizing there is a deficit. And this is most commonly perceived in right hemisphere dysfunction, not in left hemisphere dysfunction. In fact, that is so grossly true across all the categories we'll discuss that I will point out where it is not true, but generally speaking, in almost all cases, the strange set of beliefs are due to the left hemisphere working in an unbalanced way, in which the right hemisphere is not giving its anchoring in reality. And then there's asomatognosia, which is not recognizing a part of the body as belonging to one. This often happens after a stroke, for example. A non-functioning part of the body can be denied to exist at all. In a rather more unusual continuation of this idea, sometimes people will deny that it belongs to them at all. It may belong to somebody else in the room, the person in the next bed to them, to the examiner himself, or whoever it is. And that's called somatoparaphrenia. And somatoparaphrenia is almost entirely, almost always due to right hemisphere dysfunction. I think a principle I've mentioned before is that the more extreme the abnormality, the more likely it is to be due to deficits in the right hemisphere, not in the left. And then another thing we may have touched on briefly in talking about attention is a condition known as anosodiaphoria, which means a kind of incongruous, inappropriate affect in relation to a deficit. So being jokey, in denial, irritable, or whatever about something that should be, one would have thought, a matter of concern to the individual. So those are all some of the ones we've touched on before. We may have mentioned also, because it seems to be separately occurrent, is prosopagnosia, which means the inability to recognize a face. And there are a number of aspects of right hemisphere function that seem to me to suggest that this would be likely to be a right hemisphere deficit state. It's true that facial recognition is largely a right hemisphere phenomenon, frontotemporal right hemisphere phenomenon. But it's also a matter of being able to recognize a whole as distinct from the parts. You don't recognize a face by going big nose, hair parted in the middle, whatever it may be. You take the whole thing in as a whole. And it's also requires a capacity to recognize the same constellation of features, the same whole of a face, at a range of different angles and different lights, and therefore to be able to be very flexible in the way that one sees things. There's also a whole category known as delusional misidentification. And this is when somebody thinks that somebody close to them has been replaced by an imposter. And it's the inverse of that is the Cotile Syndrome, in which people see somebody they know in somebody that they don't know. They mistake somebody they've never seen before, for example, their partner. And there's also lycanthropy, where one mistakes one's own body and thinks that in fact one's been turned into a wolf. So these are all rather unusual. And Capgras and Frege are due really to having no sense of the continuity of a whole over time. In talking about prosopagnosia, I pointed out that the right hemisphere is the one that's able to perceive a whole. And a human being is a whole in the sense that they're much more than the sum of all the observations you might make about them. They are that single person with all their particularity. And that person exists over time. When one sees changes, one doesn't imagine now a new person has been created. One imagines that there is persistence of an individual. I suppose also one ought to mention kinds of paranoia. Paranoia in psychiatry doesn't just mean a feeling of threat. It means mistaken referral to the self. So one might see something on the television talking about a leading politician, and one thinks that whatever is going on television refers to you, and that you may be transformed into Jesus Christ or the leader of MI5. These would be classed as paranoid delusions in which one's sense of oneself and the place one occupies in the world has been radically altered. Then there's Othello Syndrome, which is a form of delusional jealousy, in which people believe, in the absence of evidence, that somebody is being unfaithful to them. This is often associated with alcohol abuse, but it's also more commonly comes about after a right hemisphere deficit when it follows a brain injury. And then there's Declarable Syndrome, which is an extraordinary phenomenon that's been celebrated in films like Plain Misty for Me, in which a person believes that somebody famous, maybe a film star, might be a politician, might be a member of the royal family, is secretly in love with them and sending messages about this. And this can be dangerous for the person. As indeed the Othello Syndrome can be dangerous, because if you believe that somebody is unfaithful to you, you may try to harm them. And Declarable Syndrome works in a slightly different way, that when you realize that you are suddenly this object of love to some person, you start sending messages to them. You may even go and try and find them out. And if they reject your advances, they may become violent. And then, of course, there's a marvelous syndrome which we ought to spend a little more time on, called Cotile Syndrome, which is effectively a syndrome in which somebody believes that they are already dead. So, Alex, what do you think about Cotile Syndrome? It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes, and especially because you mentioned that this can be interpreted as a strong sense of devitalization. And when you explain the
Yes,
example of the patient that not only thinks it's dead,
yes,
but asks when the physician pulls some blood out of the patient could not believe it belongs to him or her. And also you
yes,
mentioned some of those patients demand to be buried and so on. Yeah, again, this
yes,
is hard to believe that can happen, and yet it does. And
yes,
I was wondering, again, the relationship between that in a clearly dysfunctional brain with a more, let's say, functional brain of a scientist studying life as if it was a machine, as if it was dead. Again, I know it's a jump from a clinical case to a philosophical stance, if you wish, but you seem to suggest it briefly in that paragraph. And also related to that, I was wondering about these syndromes. Maybe this is a separate question, but I was wondering about this and other syndromes 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, where perhaps mechanistic philosophy wasn't so prevalent, and to what extent those syndromes are universally held, kind of cultural universals, or to what extent there's something in them that's amplified or maybe created because of the zeitgeist of the times. I know this is kind of a follow-up question that brings us further
mm,
away, but there's
mm,
something
mm.
interesting. Let me just pose like a third derivative of the question, and maybe we can rewind, because that's something I wanted to ask you on our previous occasion, which is that all these cases that neurology offers, in a way, are rather different than the cases that neuroscience would offer. And so here there's a triangle between neurology, neuroscience, and philosophy. I will come back to this later on. I think it's more appropriate towards the end of our conversation today. But to rewind, what can be said about Cotile's delusion and the way of thinking not only about ourselves, but also about living organisms as machines, which is what these patients, in a way, would believe of themselves, that if they cut, they may find oil instead of blood. You seem to mention also in another piece of
Yes.
paragraph. So this is totally intriguing to me, to what extent this can be extrapolated and what it means for the patient too.
Yes, you remind me that not strictly under the heading of Cotile syndrome, but sometimes people believe that they've been transformed into an inanimate object. For example, one woman says that she feels like she's a chest of drawers, which is a remarkable thought. But the common thread there is the loss of animacy, the reduction of the animate to the inanimate. And you raise a very interesting point about when this might have become apparent and whether it was apparent in the ancient world. I don't know of any accounts of it in the ancient world, though there are accounts of most of our broad syndromes, certainly of paranoia, probably delusional jealousy and so forth. But the particular thing of Cotard is interesting because it's named after not the first person to describe it, but the fourth person to describe it in the 19th century. But the first descriptions go back to the 18th century. And interesting, the first descriptions of schizophrenia go back to the 18th century. And what can one say about the 18th century? It's the era in which the scientific revolution was taking off, the era of the Enlightenment, very important movement, but the tendency in both of these things is to think of life in a more mechanistic, more detached way than we normally would think about it. So you raise a point that I think is fascinating. What one can say is that this aspect of right hemisphere functioning, that it is the one that allows us to see things as animate, is seen across a range of conditions. So you can temporarily suppress either the right or the left temporal lobe. And with the right temporal lobe suppressed, people see animate objects, they see animate entities, living things, as inanimate objects, and with the left hemisphere suppressed, they see life in everything. They see that the sun is alive because it moves in the sky. They think a stone is alive because it's got atoms that are dancing in it. And they think that food is somehow, it has a sort of an animate relationship with the eater. So these things are intriguing, I agree. And we might come on to talking about appetite as well. Abnormalities of appetite tend to follow right hemisphere damage. It's true that anorexia nervosa is also largely related to right hemisphere deficits, although it's not, strictly speaking, a problem of appetite at all. But it is certainly a delusional syndrome which affects people's sense of themselves, of their body, and issues in a desire to reduce what one eats.
Yes, indeed.
In the case of Cotile's, though, I think, one of the things that bears out exactly what you say is the case of a man who believed that one of his relatives was in fact a machine, and took a chainsaw to him to cut off his head and find the chips inside this machine, this robot. So it's a thing that we see in a number of right hemisphere deficit conditions, that people think of other people as well as themselves as zombies. They see them as purely mechanisms. A man described by R.D. Laing thought that his wife was some kind of a machine, because when he told her a joke, she would laugh, but she was just programmed to do this. So once you get thinking like this, of course, there's no way out of it, because everything can be interpreted as an aspect of a machine. But you're very right to draw parallels between the way we now think, increasingly are persuaded to think by popular science and by sometimes the contemporary philosophers, to think of ourselves as zombies or machines.
Yes, lumbering robots, famous
Lumbering
phrase.
robots.
Yes. Well, just to say something more on it and see what you think, because I'm always puzzled by the normal and the pathological, and the fact there's a blur line between them. And we're often talking about brain damage and really obvious striking cases. But could we endogenously be suppressing the right hemisphere dominance, and maybe doing it accidentally so? But is it, and it also has to do with, if you want, brain and mind and brain top-down regulation, if you wish. Like, it's not just that you need to have a stroke or an accident. Like, maybe by practice, consciously or not, deliberately or not, we may be endogenously suppressing the right hemisphere up to a point where we are starting to come somewhat near these cases. Would that be a totally crazy thing to say for somebody like me who has no training in neurology?
No, it wouldn't be crazy at all. It accords very much, certainly, with my view, because after all, another way in which human beings are not machines is they aren't programmed to have certain responses. We alter all the time. We are in a continual process of growth, in reciprocal relationship to the environment. And by the environment in this case, one would mean the sort of way in which the intellectual environment affects us, what we hear, how we're trained to think in school, the ways that are reinforced by the activities that we do, the way in which we spend our working lives. All of this may be geared towards a mechanical view of what a human being is and what a human being is doing in this world. And as you know, that's absolutely central to my wish for this book, that we will explore what a human being is and what the world is like and how we relate. And spoiler alert, I believe that we believe ourselves and we believe nature to be mechanisms, even if we may not say that, and scientists often do say explicitly that, we've been trained to think more or less in that way about them. But in doing that, we mistake the most important characteristics of both.
And this is a perfect segue, I think, to talk about the body and the altered role of the body, which is exactly what follows after the description of the delusions you just made in your chapter. So if you may, can we talk about the body? And here I had already, I mean, we can go through, again, the fascinating list, and perhaps we should, of altered role of the body. But I would at least particularly need a clarification of what's the body schema. Because again, and this helps tremendously, I think, to everybody, and neuroscience too, because neuroscience, it's rediscovering the role of the body. But perhaps there are different notions of the body. Even the phenomenologists, as you know, use two German words to refer to the lived body and the objective body in a way, right? Now, yes. But body schema seems something also very juicy to understand differences of the perception of the body. So if you want, we can start with that and then go through the list, which is interesting too.
Yes, what you're referring to, as you know, is that in German there's a distinction made between Leib, which is the living body, and Körper, which is the body on the dissecting table. And of course, we make a distinction in English. I don't know, you must do in Spanish too, I imagine, but we make a distinction between the body and a corpse. A corpse is the body like the Körper that is objectified and dead. One aspect of modernism is that it has cultivated an uncanny idea of the body and of people as corpses and as zombies. But yes, you refer to the differences between the hemispheres here. And one of the most basic differences is that body parts are present in the left hemisphere, but the body as a whole only in the right. So if you ask somebody who's got right temporoparietal damage to draw a body, they will draw a series of disconnected parts. And they think of the body as a collection, a connection of parts, where it isn't at all put together in the way a machine is. It exists as a whole. So that's a good place to begin. The body schema is not just a visual image of the body. It's an image in every sense. So it's proprioceptive, which means that we have a sense of where the parts of our body are. If we close our eyes, we know where the parts of our body are, and we know where it is in space, and we have a sense of inhabiting it. This is right hemisphere mediated. And what happens in anorexia, I must just return to that, is quite interesting, because one of the things one notices in people with anorexia is that they have a kind of loss of normal affect. Their relationship to the world is somewhat detached and bizarre, and they don't have the normal range of empathic feeling. That seems to be lost in this illness, which first of all is another reason for thinking that maybe the right hemisphere is affected here. But there are other reasons where we have examined cases of anorexia coming on after a tumor or a stroke. They have come on overwhelmingly after a right hemisphere tumor or stroke. And there is even a fascinating case of somebody with life-crippling anorexia who had a left hemisphere stroke, and her anorexia went away overnight after years of being resistant to treatment. So this is extraordinary. What it also incidentally flags up is that the hemispheres are always in a sort of balance, and that sometimes the appearance of a deficit in the other hemisphere from the one that's already damaged can improve the situation rather than necessarily make it worse. Yeah. So there's that. And then I just mention a few other possibilities. I mean, another bizarre thing about the body schema is that it appears that it's innate, that it's not something that you derive from experience, but that you are born with. Why do I say that? Because people who are born without certain limbs nonetheless have a body schema in which those limbs are present, and they can have phantom limb phenomena. You know, the phantom limb refers to the situation where somebody has lost a limb or it's been amputated, and they go on feeling things in the limb. The space where the limb, as it were, should be, is preserved in the mind. But these are people who have never had, for example, arms, but nonetheless they can feel their arms and they can feel their hands gesticulating when they speak. So this is something inheritable. It's not just something derived from experience. But once again, where there are phantom limbs occurring after injuries, and there are some really amazing cases, one involved 6 phantom limbs in one person. But I describe these in the book. They almost always, not entirely every single case, but overwhelmingly most of them occur after right hemisphere damage. And then there are, I mean, I should just mention these, and then we can talk more generally. There's a condition called xenomelia, in which people take against a limb, and it's perfectly healthy, normal limb, but demand that it's amputated. It's a very strange condition. There's a slightly milder one called misoplegia, in which people just take against a limb and disown it and hate it and slap it and wish it would go. This again is pretty much always a right hemisphere deficit phenomenon. So those would be some things to think about. There are others, but let's just deal with what occurs to us out of that.
Well, what occurs to me again is that the left hemisphere is not your body's best friend. Probably because what you just explained with respect to the image and the inhabiting of it and conceiving it as a whole, rather than here is this part and here is that part. That comes again clearer once you see the constellation of things that can happen, which also brings me to a point that I wanted to ask you before, and that you'll also make explicit in this chapter too, which is that we may think that we have parts and then build wholes, or that we have these partial ways of seeing the world, and that maybe the left hemisphere is figuring out, and then somehow the right hemisphere just figures it out, puts it together. But it's actually not this. It's not like this how it works. We start with the whole again, which is what Jan Kalevich called, I think, the demiurgian urge or principle, like this idea that we put things together from bits back to whole. But he was saying, no, we would have like this whole and quote unquote normal way of attending and feeling our own bodies, and this then fragments. But it's not that we have fragments and then the right hemisphere again just glues them together, which I think it's very important for your metaphysical points that will come in quite a few chapters. That again, here you could start to suspect this.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's a very good point. What the left hemisphere does to the body, since it doesn't really understand it as a whole, is to imagine it as a utility, as a machine that it operates. And don't forget that whereas the right hemisphere is aware of a whole range of a hierarchy of values, the left hemisphere is overwhelmingly concerned with use, utility, maximizing utility or pleasure. So things only exist in order to be ways of manipulating or exploiting the world. And we may have mentioned this, but the left hemisphere is particularly the hemisphere in which tools and machines are represented. Animacy can be represented in either hemisphere, though it tends to be more the right hemisphere. But machines and tools are coded principally and almost completely in the left hemisphere. And to come back to the body, you see, the left hemisphere imagines, when it doesn't understand the whole thing, that it thinks, well, I know how to make a machine. I know how to put this together with that. And a chain of cause and effect results in me being able to produce a certain desirable effect. So that's the way it models everything. But that is a disaster when it comes to trying to understand life, because when a body is created in utero, it is not, of course, put together at all. Bits of a whole differentiate within the whole at the same moment in time, and there's a gradual process over in humans a 9-month period.
Yes,
indeed.
indeed.
And it just perhaps also worth mentioning while we're on this subject that the right hemisphere is just generally much more in touch with the body. First of all, as we'll discuss when we come to chapter 6, its understanding of emotion is far greater than the left hemisphere's. It's much better able to interpret emotion and to interpret the body. So it can interpret the body language of the person one's talking to, what their facial expressions mean, and what their posture means, and so forth. And the right hemisphere has more profuse connections between the frontal cortex and the limbic system lying lower in the brain, but a very important area for bringing together cognition with emotion. And once again, as I say, the right hemisphere is superior in this. The right hemisphere in this area is also enlarged and has more of a certain special kind of neurons called phoneconomone neurons in the right than it does on the left. Perhaps that's too much detail for the moment, but anyway, that's a very good point that you make, yes.
Okay, let me stay a moment here with this altered role of the body before we move on to the many other interesting and juicy things that are in the chapter. Because I have a question from my ignorance of neurology. I'm reading your book, Iain. I'm becoming more and more interested in it, and psychiatry too. And then I have these naive, overarching questions. And the one I'm going to ask you now is about the kind of anthropological, if you want, ethnographic aspects or dimensions of this. Because at the end of this part, when you talk about the role of the body, you talk about the Coro syndrome in the Far East, where people feel that genitalia are retracting, and then of the dat in India, the idea that the vital life is drained with semen. And so I was wondering more broadly how Eurocentric or Western-centric neurology is in missing and maybe more fascinating, and not just fascinating, but insightful, again, when you put them in a constellation, syndromes that are not so stereotypical of the countries you or I live in.
Yes. Well, you're right, because Coro, the syndrome in which men believe their genitalia are shrinking and will eventually disappear, and an overwhelming fear that when this happens they will die, I think the word Coro is Japanese, and I think it's in Japan that it was perhaps first alluded to. But since then we've found that it exists in Africa, it exists in Europe, but it's probably commoner in the Far East. And that, yes, is only described in India, but maybe that's because of the way the Indian culture thinks of the relationship between body fluids and the body. The idea there is that semen as a life force is being drained from one in one's urine, and that eventually the life force will go from one. What I ought to point out is that both of these are in a way anti-life, if you like. One is believing that your vital organs, as it were, the ones that generate life and propagate life, will disappear, and then you will disappear. And that is also this draining of vital forces. The trouble with making too much out of this is that, again, possibly because they are thought of conventionally as culture-bound syndromes, is that they haven't been so extensively researched as many of the ones that I've referred to. But on the evidence that we have, which is probably insufficient to make any very large generalization, at least as far as it goes, it seems clear that these tend to be more common after right hemisphere deficits.
Yeah, good. Okay, so should we move to that part of the chapter entitled somewhat like Pessimism, Optimism, and Realism?
Yes. Yes. What I was getting at is that there is a whole constellation of things to do with the reality testing of the right hemisphere and the lack of it in the left. So when the right hemisphere is not functioning properly, the unbalanced dominance of the left hemisphere leads to various kinds of false optimism. We probably discussed already the business of denying a paralysis, completely denying that a limb that is very obviously paralyzed, that there's anything wrong with it at all. So that's an extreme case of it. But we also know that from some interesting research done on subjects when one hemisphere at a time was anesthetized, that the left hemisphere has a very high opinion of itself and thinks that it has all kinds of strengths that the friends and relatives of this person don't agree with, whereas the right hemisphere tends, if anything, to be slightly self-deprecating, tends to be a little over-modest about its capacities. In the normal state, so research on ordinary non-pathological individuals shows that we tend to attribute good outcomes of a situation, over attribute them to something we've contributed. So when we get a good result that we like, we exaggerate the amount that we did to attain this result. Whereas when there's a result we don't like, we minimize, again, wrongly, the role that we played. So we tend to live in this state of sort of somewhat denial, at any rate at the moment in the West, which of course is highly relevant to our situation. One of the things that one might want to talk about is, well, is the right hemisphere the grounds for excessive pessimism? And I think there's some evidence that that may be the case, but there's also some evidence that where it takes us is effectively towards realism. We know that depressed patients make more realistic judgments, not only about their own future, but about things that are unconnected to it. For example, the right hemisphere is not only better than the left hemisphere, but better than the normal subject in estimating the duration of a period of time, which has very little to do with mood, although it is connected with mood, as everything is. So that's interesting. And insight, you see, insight is something that's very important. Having insight into yourself and insight into your own illness seems to be dependent on the right hemisphere. One of the things that we would tend to see in schizophrenia is a range of phenomena that are more typical of right hemisphere deficits than left. We'll come to that in a future chapter. But even so, even when we can see that somebody with schizophrenia shows insufficient activity in the right hemisphere and excessive activity in the left hemisphere, when the person begins to get insight into their illness, it comes when there is more activity in the right frontal cortex. So the right frontal cortex is important for understanding what's wrong with oneself, reality testing in all modes. Now, I'll just add one little rider here, which is that you would think that depressive delusions must be due to an imbalance in favor of the right hemisphere. But in fact, they don't appear to be so. They appear, when they become delusional, to be due to a left hemisphere overdrive phenomenon. These are states in which people imagine they've committed some heinous crime, and they go to a police station and turn themselves in and say, "I caused the invasion of the Ukraine," or something like this. But when they're that far out of touch with reality, then it's no longer a right hemisphere dominant state. It's more of a left hemisphere dominant state.
I particularly appreciated the caveat here on the relationship between depression and the right hemisphere. And as you say, this complex. And I appreciated it because it's not copying and pasting the same rule. Like there's some exceptions, or at least there's some subtlety in the logic. And because one gets used to, of course, write again, and he said, wait a minute, because the right one is related to the left one, the frontal part of the left one. So it's like you could actually sketch a little diagram with a circuit with main areas and realize that the logic can be subtle. And so that seemed to be in a way, a nice exception. It's not an exception, but it's something that one must interpret with more care. And that I think makes the case, as I think in biology. I think in physicists, we don't like exceptions so much, but in biology and in mind science, life and mind sciences, I would dare to think that exceptions are really helpful to the rule.
Yes, it's often difficult in a talk like this to be able to make some of the more subtle distinctions. They're easier to make in the text and sometimes with diagrams. But the way in which the right hemisphere relates to depression is a little bit complicated, as you said. It seems to be to do with dominance of the right frontal cortex. So this is at the front of the brain on the right. And that can become, if you like, overbearing when there isn't enough counterbalance to it. And there are two kinds of counterbalance to the right frontal cortex. One is the left frontal cortex, clearly, but the other is the posterior cortex of the same hemisphere. For example, the point of the right frontal cortex and the left frontal cortex is to have a balancing relationship with the posterior cortex of the same hemisphere. So that means that the right frontal cortex can become over-dominant if there is something that is suppressing the left frontal cortex or something that is suppressing the right posterior cortex. That could be, for example, a left frontal or a right posterior stroke. I mean, that could be. That's one of the possibilities for the sake of demonstrating what we're talking about here. But you're quite right. I don't want to give the impression that absolutely everything is due to right hemisphere dysfunction. But virtually all these syndromes that we've talked about are so clearly due to right hemisphere failure. And that's not surprising. It might seem surprising to somebody meeting this area for the first time, but it's not actually surprising, because if it's true that the right hemisphere is the one that is engaged in reality testing, the one that is actually giving us the information about the truth of the world we're in, relatively more than the left hemisphere, which is playing with these ideas, mapping them and representing them, then this is what would naturally follow. Just to give you another example of something where it isn't so clear-cut, there are two conditions which relate to a strange relationship to one's body. One is autoscopy, in which one is outside oneself and sees oneself. And this seems to be more common after right hemisphere deficits. Sometimes after removing the right temporal lobe altogether, people start to have this experience. And yet, there is a related condition called heotoscopy, in which people see an image of themselves coming towards them or standing at a distance, and that seems to have no clear lateralization. It might actually be commoner after left hemisphere damage.
Yes, and there is this other example or case or kind of category within pessimism, optimism, realism that you mentioned that I'm particularly interested in, which is magical thinking. And you also say there's no clear lateralization, which is interesting. And again, to me, it brings more credibility to your whole case, the fact that you bring forth cases that are not so clear. But it's also magical thinking. It's interesting to me also for, in a way, allow me to push it to socio-political issues related to science and the authority of science and the credulity that some people have within and without science. And also, if we go back to the definition, or at least how you explain how people understand what magical thinking is, it's a belief in forms of causation that by convention are invalid. And I totally enjoy that, because by convention, then you wonder then, what's the grounding for magical thinking and non-magical thinking if you have to say by convention. And again, as a footnote to that, I'm thinking of science, maybe by default, and this fixation science has today with efficient causes and the rejection of other forms of causation by convention, like final cause or formal cause even. And so it's funny, because it would be like that current neuroscientists and biologists would say that Aristotle, who put forth these fourth causes, was engaging in magical thinking, except for maybe one or two of his causes, right? And so that immediately brings us to, again, this hesitation as what is real and what is not real. Is it what the authoritative figure says? It's what people believe. To what extent this is convention? It's confusing, I must admit, but it's very interesting that it appears here in this context already.
Yes, that's right. As you point out, Aristotle names 4 kinds of causation, but science seems to accept only efficient causation. Final causation, that something happens to achieve a certain outcome, is actually privately believed by many scientists who are not prepared to say that that is a force in nature when talking in public. We'll have more to say about that on another occasion. But you're absolutely right. Magical thinking is something that actually it turns out that most people do, including scientists. So people who don't believe in magic and who very strongly say they don't believe any such thing, there are a number of experiments. There's one experiment which I kind of like, which is a thought experiment, which was put to people who either believe that in magic existing or completely denied that magic could exist. They were asked to imagine a situation in which a witch comes up to them and says she can put a spell on their future. And if she says that she can put a spell on their future to improve it, then only those who believe in magic will accept it, and those who don't believe in magic will say no. But if the witch says she can put a curse on your future, interestingly, even those who say they don't believe in magic turn down this offer. So they react differently depending on whether it's a good outcome or a bad outcome. Whereas if they are true to the fact they don't believe that such things can possibly exist, it wouldn't make any difference.
Yes. I love these studies about myths in the human mind, and to what extent myth has a connotation as something we should debunk and get rid of. And at the same time, I really believe that myths are also ways of tapping into truths. And at least one could say some of them may have evolutionary value, thinking in terms of false positives and false negatives, which in a way, it's a good way for me to wrap up this section on pessimism and optimism, because as you were saying at the beginning, the left hemisphere is more prone to emphasize success, what I call promisomics. When you write a grant, you need to be very left brain, but acknowledging potential failure or being more careful about things that you may be getting wrong, which is a more conservative attitude, is also important to have in balance. So again, I see here emerging this balance of opposites between the exploiting the familiarity, but also being willing to take risks and explore the new, and how false positives and false negative, again, when in balance, can work very well. But the moment one is dominating over the other, even within or without science, we enter into terrain where science ceases to be scientific, and that's really a curse.
Yes, I don't know whether you want to talk about myth at this point, but I completely agree with you that there's nothing about the word myth that suggests it's untrue. There are certain truths that can really only be understood through a myth. And in the ancient Greek world, the word mythos was the more important path to truth than logos, from which we eventually get the word logic. And that's because really deep truths can't be encompassed easily in words or rationalized into a few propositions. They can be best understood by images and stories, narratives and myths. And there's nothing wrong with these. In fact, we can't live without them. And those who think they haven't got one, as many scientists do believe, are simply using the myth of man is a machine, which is a myth. It's a workable myth. I happen to think it's false.
Yes, and so here, I have, before we finish, if you still have 10 more minutes or so, because I think it would be good to finish talking about reason and truth and reality again, which is where your chapter ends. But before that, there are two important quote unquote myths that I would like you to help clarify. The first one is the lateralization between male and female. So whether there are differences or not, to what extent it is politically correct to talk about them, well, we'll talk about them anyways, because I'm asking about what the science suggests, and also whether this myth may not be just totally, let's say, torn apart, but maybe qualified, because I think what you explain is that it's counterintuitive, actually, when one finds out if there are differences between, like the idea, basically the common idea would be that males are more left brain and females are more right brain. And I think you suggest that's not the case, but not only that, that's actually the opposite, which is a surprising thing to read.
Yes, it's a difficult subject to talk about these days, as you acknowledge. All I can do is follow the science and report what the science shows. It doesn't show that women are more likely to use the right hemisphere than men are. In fact, as you say, like it or not, quite what the science means, I don't know, but just at the simplest level, it's testosterone that causes the right hemisphere to expand in utero in males, for a start. And I often say that the right hemisphere is larger than the left, which is broadly true, but that effect is much more powerfully contributed to by males in a 50-50 sample than it is by females. In fact, there's not much difference in females. So there's that. And then there are cases in which the sexes differ in which one is more active, which hemisphere is more active in carrying out a task. And I look at all of them without fear or favor. So when I look at the evidence about the difference between hemispheres in cases where perhaps men and women use different hemispheres to tackle a certain task, the difference is almost always that women use the left hemisphere where men use the right hemisphere. Now, it's difficult to know how to interpret that. It's far too complex a subject just to say, well, men are more right-brained, but it's certainly not easy to create a story that they're less right hemisphere dependent. Again, it may well be that, this is just a speculation, but it may well be that, and I think there is evidence that this is the case, that male brains are more specialized. So the differences between the right hemisphere and the left are bigger in males than they are in females. There is more overlap in the female brain, more redundancy, if you like. But what this means is it makes the brain more resistant to any kind of insult. So if, for example, you're highly specialized, then there'll be more overall deficits that can't be compensated for in such a brain. Whereas if there is a more balanced distribution of functions, then obviously it's easier to take some kind of a deficit. And this probably explains why neurodevelopmental disorders are generally much more common in men than they are in women, in boys than they are in girls. This has something to do with the structure of the corpus callosum, which is also different in females. And it's neither good nor bad that there seems to be more connection between the right and left, if you like, more overlap between the right and the left in women. This probably results in more deficits and more extreme talents in males, because this separation means that you can have high specialization in either the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere in males, which produces the archetypal nerd in the case where the left hemisphere is more dominant. But there are also many cases, of course, in which male brains can be seen to exercise extreme right hemisphere functioning, such as in great mathematicians. I mean, there are, of course, great female mathematicians, but preponderantly there are more males. And mathematics, surprisingly, is very much a right hemisphere dominant procedure. The things you're taught in school, how to carry out certain rules, how to know your times tables, all that is absolutely left hemisphere stuff. But the ability to see how to resolve a problem or to come up with some new finding in mathematics is very dependent on the right hemisphere, as is poetry.
Well, thanks for sharing more about the evidence and acknowledging it's complicated. I think that's the honest attitude of a scientist, and also it's brave, because we know these topics are not easy to even mention. So thank you for those clarifications. And since you just alluded to this, that's the second kind of pop myth I wanted to bring forth, which is the old dichotomy between left hemisphere equals rational and right hemisphere equals emotional. And your and others, but your explicit idea that, well, why would we want to separate reason and emotion in the first place? And here you quote Chesterton, which is great. You say Chesterton says, the madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason. And so I think this is a good way to start wrapping up this chapter. And actually it's towards the end, because it brings us back to, again, and the reasoning processes and the brain hemispheres and truth and reality, and a better understanding, a more sophisticated understanding of reason and emotion as something that goes together, that's entangled.
Yes, indeed. Perhaps I should just mention before going into that area that it seems to me that biology takes fewer risks with the female brain because women's role in the propagation of the species is more critical than that of the male. The male is less important. So it's okay for nature to experiment with males because they are dispensable, whereas the mother is not dispensable. The future of the species depends on her. So the female brain is more robust in that way. But you're absolutely right that emotion and reason are related to one another. In fact, the French 18th century philosopher Vauvenargues says that it is emotion that has taught us to reason. And reasoning and emotion are very much dependent on things in each hemisphere. So each hemisphere has a capacity for emotion. Each hemisphere has a capacity for reason. What is perhaps a bit surprising is that the right hemisphere plays a crucial role in deduction. The left hemisphere plays a more crucial role in induction, though it also plays a role in deduction. For those who are not familiar with the terms, induction means seeing that something is more likely to happen because it has happened before. The sun has risen every day of my life in the morning, so I reason that tomorrow it will. That is induction. But deduction is being able to see what follows from some premises. So, you can understand that when you see certain evidence, it suggests something quite separate, that it's likely that something is the case. But in any case, the left hemisphere is not at all unemotional. It's very emotional in an unpleasant way. It's more beset with things like irritation, disgust, and anger. Anger is the most lateralized of all emotions, and guess what? It lateralizes to the left hemisphere. So we need to refine our ideas. The left hemisphere is not necessarily better at reasoning than the right hemisphere. In fact, it's quicker at reasoning where all the elements in the problem or in the situation that's presented are familiar. So if the kind of situation is familiar, the way in which you have to reach a conclusion is familiar, the left hemisphere will do it more rapidly than the right. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that the right hemisphere is more willing to entertain possible other outcomes, which slows it down very slightly. But in cases where one needs to think in a different way, or the situation is atypical in a particular respect, or more complex, the right hemisphere plays the crucial role in arriving at the conclusion. So it's certainly not true that the left hemisphere is more dependable than the right. I mean, everything I'm suggesting in this whole series is that the left hemisphere is less dependable than the right is more in touch with reality. And although one can produce exceptions, and I do. As you know, in the margins, in the notes, I give an analysis and breakdown of all the information, and where there seems to be something that goes against that hypothesis, I recognize it there. If I've missed something, it's because I didn't see it. It's not because I've hidden it. So yes. I'm trying to be very balanced in the way I put across the information. But the conclusions to be drawn are, I'm afraid, really rather clear.
Indeed. So maybe my final comment to this, I really enjoyed this conversation. And the last comment for my side will be, you land to talking about truth and saying, you say there's never truth without context and interaction. And again, the right hemisphere wins, if we can put it in a headline, wins with respect to being more reliable and veridical. And of course, if we believe that reality is radically contextual and participatory, then, well, we know which one to trust. And at the same time, that, in my case, points to new ways of doing biology and neuroscience, because again, I'm a physicist and I'm not going to say that physics is easy, but something I want to say, quote unquote, as a physicist, is that perhaps physics has succeeded because we physicists have picked the easiest problems for 400 years. And then life and mind came later, like sometimes in neuroscience happens too. We have a tendency and arrogant in dismissing psychology, for instance, right? But if it's really true that life and mind are radically contextual again, then this idea of a very specified, simple situation, almost algorithmic, that one would need to solve, well, that can be hard, but at the same time, it's easy. Whereas situations where everything is embodied and depends on what it is in space and time and so on, well, that requires, in a way, a new kind of mind to be studied. And so that's a take home I take constantly from your book, and I see it again appearing at the end of this chapter that I enjoyed very much.
Yes, thank you. I wouldn't have said, but then I'm not a physicist, that physicists have avoided the hard problems. They seem to me to have found themselves beset with difficult problems and be the scientists more than any other who have engaged with them. I think that biology is stuck in a time warp. It seems to be stuck in a mid-19th century view that that life is some hydraulic mechanism, which it isn't. So yes, you point to context as vital, and the interaction between the observer and what is observed, what I would prefer to call the encounter that goes on in all our experience and from which we derive our knowledge. So on first principles, one would imagine the right hemisphere, which is much better at understanding things in context and is much better in not cutting itself off, as it were, from the world that it's perceiving. In those respects, you would expect the right hemisphere to be more veridical. But the ultimate point is that we don't need to form a sort of abstract judgment about which one is more veridical. We see it actually taking place in front of our eyes. That's why I've talked about some of these extraordinary delusions, because in those cases, nobody can tell me that the left hemisphere is being more in touch with reality than the right. It's quite simple. It is not. And throughout, we can see this. We will see this also in looking at emotional and social intelligence, even at cognitive intelligence. The whole picture is very clear that if we adopt the view of the right hemisphere in preference to that of the left, we will be not often caught out, as it were, by experience and by reality. But if we adopt the other way around and see the world according to the left hemisphere, we will make many mistakes in understanding who we are and what the world is.
This is a great way to end, Ian, and thank you very much.